And I'm gonna welcome up John and Candace Uran to the stage.
And I showed up to class, and before the class started, I fell over and my heart had stopped. I had a cardiac arrest. I recall we got up fairly early with Archie, or in the 6 range.
Safe bet.
6 and 6:30.
The day in question was just like a regular Saturday. It was nothing out of the ordinary.
We were just returning from all the COVID lockdowns to sort of some sense of normality.
As sort of per usual, I got up and made coffee. We played with Archie a little bit as he woke up. We sat and had a coffee. I remember going upstairs to our 3rd floor, watching some cartoons probably, reading some books with him. I was getting ready then to go to the class, and I vaguely remember saying goodbye to you and giving you a little kiss on the cheek, and then got in the car and drove less than 10 minutes.
Every Saturday is the long class that they have. It's an hour-long session. And it's usually a really good mix of people. It's everyone who comes in the mornings, evenings, afternoons. They all come together, and there's usually a really good energy.
I was set up in station number 1, so I was right at the entrance, so right near the door. The way the studio is set up, it's almost like a bottleneck. It all funnels in from that corner. So I was like right in the corner.
John came in a little bit late. Didn't seem anything out of the ordinary, and I gave him a number on the far side of the room. So when you walk through the door, the very far corner is where I set him up.
Literally, as soon as we got to our spots, stood up, we're looking at the screens, ready to start our warm-ups.
The warm-up's on the screen. I don't really have to do much at that point, so I ran to the back to quickly grab a hair tie.
John had started running. It looked like he was running to the washrooms. And then from where I was standing, it looked like he had tripped on a kettlebell. You could see like all of his muscles and his hands just tense up. And I'm like, okay, this guy looks like he's having a seizure.
I just opened up the door to look. Another member came running in and said, "Hey, Rob, someone's collapsed on the floor." I come out, and literally around the corner, so John had made it all the way across the floor. He was on the ground, and there was a group of people around him.
And I just remember like trying to like move him, and I remember just getting his shoulder and his like calf and like pulling him to his side. And we're like, okay, I don't think he's breathing.
We called 911. I asked for someone to call 911 right away, and another member quickly got on their phone, put it on speaker.
I just remember as soon as we noticed he was going blue,
I couldn't even feel his carotid artery. It was just, he was so tensed up. So I was able to kind of feel his radial pulse, and it was getting faint. And so there was little bits of breathing going, and then all of a sudden there was a bit of a pause, and then John made this loud, audible, like gasp kind of grunt noise, and just went completely silent.
Shortly after John left, Archie, who couldn't walk at the time, fell. So I FaceTimed my father. And I received a few beeps, basically, when I was, with no caller ID, when I was on FaceTime with my dad, and eventually said to him, this might be John from the gym. So I'm going to take it. And when I answered, it was the police.
As we're like saying to 911, like, he's not breathing, she like screamed, "Start CPR," and I was just like, okay.
So I made eye contact with Andrew, and I remember that. And John was just immediately flipped onto his back, shirt just yanked up. Mountain Man Andrew just got right on top of him. I sprung up. I ran to the office to grab the AED.
And I just remember like locking my elbows and dropping as much weight on his chest as I could, and just like bouncing up and down on his chest.
So I come running back, I've grabbed the AED, I pop it open, I'm turning it on.
I remember getting maybe 5 or 8 compressions onto his chest, and I heard another gasp.
And then the AED kind of walks you through what to do, and it goes heartbeat, searching for heartbeat, and it's trying to detect the heartbeat. Finally it said, no heartbeat detected, it like administer pulse.
It says stand clear. Again, between those, I'm trying to make sure that I'm still doing compressions and then quickly getting away.
And the way John's body had convulsed off the floor it's like burnt in my memory.
And then you could just hear John moaning. And when I heard him moaning, I just felt this relief.
The firefighters came in and they just kind of took over. And at that point, it says, okay, take a step back.
But the whole time I was like, that was too long. That was too much time. I don't know what's happened there. I know he's alive, but to what extent?
In that time, the paramedics arrived, and paramedics arrived really quickly. So about 10 minutes after this happened, they were on the scene and transported me to St. Joseph's Hospital, where I was admitted with the diagnosis of sudden death.
I'd never received 3 missed calls from Candace on a Saturday morning. And so just called her back, and as soon as she picked up the phone, just the anxiety and distress in her voice, but the thing that she just kept saying is, I can't lose him, I can't lose him, I can't lose him. And I'm like, lose who? Like what? Like what are you? I was trying to make sense of it, and that she was speaking just at such a fast pace.
Right.
And I said, Candace, please, just take a breath. Like what? Like, you know, and she said, the police have told me that he's been rushed to the hospital. He's in ICU.
So the police called a couple more times, eventually told me that John was on his way to the hospital and that I should go to St. Joseph's if I wanted to see him. It was kind of put that way.
I'm pretty sure it was Saturday morning. Actually, Audra was just born, and so I felt my second kid, and so fell asleep on the couch. Woke up to this my phone vibrating, and so I was like, oh, weird, Candace is calling. And so I pick up, and it was weird because she asked me how I was because she knew we just had a baby, but then her voice changed all of a sudden, and it was like in distress. It's like something happened to John. So I drove straight to Candace's house right after that, and she was there very much in distress, saying that John's in the hospital. I don't know details, but I need to go to the hospital now. I said, well, let me take you.
Jerry drove me to the hospital and we prayed on the way. He had to help me fight my way in. And then they actually sat me in a room in the ER. They said that John, was getting set up. An ER doctor spoke to me and he told me the things that I needed to know, which was that we all have a general consciousness score of 15. John was now on a ventilator while his heart was now beating again. He had a general consciousness score of 4, which he described as the same as that table, pointed to a table in the corner of the room.
So I was on call at the hospital over the weekend, and I got a call from the intensive care unit doctor saying that a young patient, 39 years old, had come in with a cardiac arrest and was on a ventilator. And that's always the worst thing to hear when you're on call.
So basically his heart did not have the ability to run his lungs or any of his other systems. So they had put him on a ventilator and on life support, and were keeping him sedated in a coma. And so I think immediately I was jumping to, well, it's just because he's had this event, right? Which they couldn't identify at the time. They'd run a number of tests already and had no idea. And he was like, no, where there's a heart attack or a heart event, typically you're brain comes back immediately. So they suspected that his brain had gone too long without oxygen.
By this point, we had the full report that he had a heart attack at the gym, and he was in ICU, and we knew that he was on life support. We knew that he'd put into a hospital-induced coma.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, maybe an hour and a half or a couple hours, I sat with 2 garbage bags beside me of the clothes that they'd cut off him, and was making phone calls. But eventually the ICU doctor came out. They told me that, best case scenario, and if they didn't find anything in a few days, like sort of midweek, they might try to back him out to see if he could respond in any way with a blink or a hand squeeze. Basically not to expect too much.
Physically, I mean, he was in great physical shape. He looked so healthy and so well when I first saw him. At that point, he was completely stable on the heart monitors. So there was no arrhythmia, there was nothing going on. It was actually remarkably bland and stable. I did an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound of the heart right at the bedside, and the structure and function of his heart looked perfectly good. So it was a little bit of a mystery as to what happened. And in that situation, you're always worried that it could be a life-threatening cardiac arrhythmia as the primary problem. It could be some sort of genetic structural abnormality where you don't see it on the echocardiogram, but something underlying that caused an arrhythmia, or it could be a blockage in the artery of the heart.
Immediately, I asked if I could, go in and be with him, but also if we could have our pastors come in. And there was hesitation, but also since everyone was looking at me like I was already a widow, I pushed and they agreed and said that religious exemption, the fact that it was the day he was arriving, they could let 2 people in.
We got confirmation from Candace that, hey, there's this allowance for us to come as pastors to come pray for John.
Death was a complete viability, and Candace had called us about that. So Jerry quickly rushed over, picked me up, and then we jumped in the car together and rushed down to the hospital as quick as possible.
I went into John's room. And it wasn't even, none of it was conscious. I didn't know what else to do. I immediately put on worship music.
There was definitely that sense of hopelessness at the hospital. One nurse stopped us on the way, and she started to give me advice on what the best pastoral advice is to do, and she said, you need to prepare Candace that she's going to be a single mom and that she's going to be a widow, and you need to prepare her for that already before we had even got in the room. And the faith in me at that point was no, that it felt like hope was all slipping away, but it's no, that can't be the story.
I still didn't picture John, the tubes and everything. So it was this, I think, urgency where I'm not going to dwell on this picture. I'm just going to start praying and believing that God is going to heal him, whatever was happening,
So I was there alone. Sam and Jerry arrived. I later learned we're only there for 20 minutes. It felt much longer.
We got into the room and there's worship playing and just this sense of peace in that room. And so it's night and day, and Candace is you could tell she was just praying. She just stopped because we entered into the room.
She was on the floor, not even on her knees, lower than that, on the floor, holding his hand.
Yes. Right.
And just in desperation for her husband. Mm-hmm. But that kind of, it makes me, Candace was the miracle worker. She stood in the gap, and she was at war already. The ground had already been worked in terms of prayer and worship, and she, just the God-fearing nature. I knew she was a God-fearing woman, but to see it at that level, it's when opposition comes in that way, your faith is really tested, and Candace, She was all over it.
Faith can still be terrified. Right. Faith can still be like just desolate and beside themselves and messy. Because I was. And, you know, some family and friends saw that. They saw that I was still terrified, that I was still shattered, brokenhearted for myself and for my son. But the difference is you know where the hope is, and you run after it with the only strength you have left.
They encouraged me to leave the hospital that night. I had to leave. I was praying, obviously. I was texting the group that were praying, and I was praying. And I looked around the room at all of our wedding photos. And yeah, I just told God that I knew what everyone was telling me, but that I couldn't live without him. And I couldn't, more than that, I couldn't sleep in this house every night without him. I just felt him whisper to my spirit that I wouldn't have to.
It was the next morning that the ICU nurse had called and said they were going to try and get him off the ventilator.
I wanted to go to the hospital first thing Sunday morning. I wasn't allowed to. We left even though they told me I couldn't come in yet. And as we parked and I was walking, as the doors opened to St. Joseph's, the electronic doors, my phone rang and I picked it up as I stepped in, the doors opening. It was a call from the ICU. They hadn't called me all night. I'd been calling and stalking them. And they, again, verified who I was and just said, your husband's no longer on the ventilator. And I think I dropped and just said, what do you mean? And then they explained, no, he's off the ventilator and he's awake and asking for you. After making a big stir at the doorway and people even advocating for us to let us in, we just ran up the stairs, ran to his room, busted in, and he was sitting up. He was sitting up, eyes open, and was able, very groggy, but able to say hello, and was asking me what had gone on, and pretty quickly asked me if I had his ring, which I pulled out. When I handed it to him, I said, you know what, because it completes a phrase of scripture. I said, what do our rings say? And I think I began the sentence and he finished it. And so I was like, okay. Through the sedation, he was still able to answer that. So I thought he might be all right.
I went up and saw him and he was talking in very small sentences. He was very confused still as to exactly what happened. But just the fact that he could respond and answer questions appropriately, it's just remarkable and a miracle. So at that point, still, it didn't quite look like a heart attack, like a blockage from the artery of the heart causing it. It still looked like it potentially was a primary arrhythmia, just the way it happened. But, he was young. He had a family history of coronary disease, meaning blockages in the arteries of the heart. So I thought he should get an angiogram.
And I just remember like a flurry of doctors and a flurry of lights and machines going, and they did the angiogram. And I remember a doctor then coming over to me, sort of leaning over me and saying, do you consent to a stent being inserted? And I said, I don't know, should I? And the doctor said, you absolutely should.
And the doctor who did it called me and said, he's got this blockage and that's the cause of the problem. And I literally teared up. I mean, from the Saturday, I had been tearing up and talking to my husband about this. My husband's a physician too, about this, young patient with this young family. And when you hear blockage, fixed, reversible, that's exactly what you want to hear. And I just teared up. It's sort of the best outcome you can hope for in that situation.
leaving the hospital from the ICU, it was quite a process because they'd never actually discharged anyone directly out of the ICU, or so we were told. But I remember leaving the hospital for the first time, and it was only 5 days, and it was a sunny day in March. I wasn't wearing a jacket, but we walked home from the hospital. And I just remember feeling like the fresh air and hearing the birds and holding my wife's hand, and still a little bit in shock from everything that had happened. But ultimately just feeling like I had a true second chance in that moment. And when I hit our front door, I was greeted by our son. And I remember coming to the front window of our home and just looking out the window as he showed me garbage trucks and dogs and people walking out the front window, and I crouched down beside him, and I just remember staring at him and saying, this is my life now, and it could have been so different, but praise God that in this moment where I've never needed him more, my wife's never needed him more, and Archie, whether he knew it or not, never needed me or God more, God completely came through and delivered our miracle.
God is capable of anything, and no matter what the outcome, he's always the answer.
Amen.
So I think, that's another, just point on the difference between luck and miracle, right? Like, luck doesn't have specificity, and the prayers, it doesn't have urgency, it doesn't have empathy, it doesn't have compassion.
Wow.
It doesn't have knowledge of you. I am such a rational person, and I am so rational that I absolutely know beyond a reasonable doubt with every fiber in my being that luck had nothing to do with this. This is the intervention of God in the living world.
Sometimes it's easier to believe for someone's miracle when you're not personally as attached to them.
Yeah.
And that's the truth. And when he's so close, hey,
Yeah.
you just
100%.
want nothing more for a miracle.
Yeah.
And then to see his hand over all circumstances leading up to it. If it was always going to happen on February 26th at 8:10 a.m. and he brought John to that gym.
It was such a knife's edge of him going either living or dying that it's just ridiculous. And when you think about just giving out numbers, if I'd given John a number in the middle of the room or by where he fell, he would have either made it to a bathroom and collapsed, he would have gone down the hallway, he could have gone into the parking lot, and none of this, none of us would have known.
Having somebody there who knew how to do CPR properly, having a defibrillator at the facility. Not all facilities have a defibrillator. Somebody knowing to put the defibrillator on him immediately. So just so many things lined up to give him the best chance of doing well.
And I would just add, the power and importance of surrounding yourself with believers and being planted in this church or that church or that church, but being surrounded by people that in times of crisis as well as times of celebration that can be around you and cover you, go to battle for you. That was everything in those moments. We were staring down a situation where there was nothing but hope in Christ. There was nothing else in our world. We didn't have hope even in medicine, although God created medicine, and thank you, amazing doctors and nurses. But this was one that the series of events that had to happen were clearly miraculous and clearly God ordained. And I've taken that principle into my everyday life, where it's just if he can move in moments like that, when literally I was dead, and bring me back and set our future for our family, he can move in the small situations as well. So there's no situation that he's not in. There's no, you cast your anxieties, cast your worries to him, God, because he can handle all of it, and he wants to handle all of it for his children.
We kind of got straight back to life because as much as we could, because we didn't know what else to do. I felt really convicted a few months ago that I don't want to. I'm never going to move on. I'm never going to move on from the fact that God saved John, that he orchestrated everything to make sure that he stayed on this planet. I never want to forget it. I never want to forget the things that he whispered to me when I was all alone. I never want to be the same person that I was before, because why would you want to be the person you were before you saw a miracle with your very own eyes? I've become convicted that I never, ever, ever want to forget it. People want you to forget trauma, but I never want to forget that this happened.